Welcome back to Real Fear Files, where the shadows speak and the past is never truly gone. Tonight, we're descending into the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, into the hollowed-out shells of homes long surrendered to time. These places stand forgotten on the ridgelines and buried deep in the valleys, yet the stories trapped inside them remain anything but silent. In this episode, we explore 9 chilling encounters pulled from the real experiences of hikers, wanderers, and curious explorers who stepped into abandoned Appalachian houses and came back forever changed. These structures may look lifeless from the outside, but inside, old tragedies echo, unseen things linger, and some rooms refuse to let their secrets rest. Every account you'll hear has been carefully reconstructed from verified testimonies. While personal details and exact coordinates have been altered to protect those involved, the events themselves remain unfiltered and deeply unsettling. If you're new to Real Fear Files, make sure to subscribe for nightly journeys into real-world horror. Tap the notification bell so you're the first to know when another story crawls out of the dark. Take a breath, steady your nerves, because it's time to step inside. Welcome to the abandoned homes of Appalachia, where something is always waiting. Jonah and Marley used to joke that the mountains around them were breathing. Not in that cheesy, poetic way tourists talked about the Appalachians, but in the way old-timers said it. Low voice, eyes cutting toward the ridgeline like they were afraid the hills might hear them. They'd grown up in a tiny mountain town where empty homes sat like busted teeth along the roads, and no trespassing signs usually meant, bet you won't. By their early 20s, slipping inside abandoned places wasn't just a pastime. It was a weird kind of ritual. They could tell which houses were nothing more than rotted boards and bad memories, and which ones carried that heavy, choking vibe that sank into your lungs. The kind of weight that made you feel like the walls didn't want you there. The place that wrecked everything didn't look like much. It slouched halfway into a hill, porch sagging like it was giving up. One corner looked chewed down, like something huge had taken a bite. Empty windows stared out, dead and hollow. The curtains inside hung in scraps, more mold than fabric now. Jonah stopped at the edge of the yard, one boot sinking into a wet bed of leaves. Marley, braver, or maybe just better at pretending, stepped ahead, her flashlight cutting through the late-day gloom. Behind them, the narrow road they'd walked disappeared into the trees. No houses, no cars, no voices. Just that long, low moan of the wind twisting through bare branches. Got a bad feeling, Jonah muttered, mostly to himself. The stillness around the house didn't match the gusty weather. It wasn't just quiet. Something about the silence felt intentional, like the whole forest refused to cross the property line. Marley looked back at him with a crooked smirk, but even she couldn't hide the tension in her eyes. She felt it too. That made it worse. They stepped onto the porch together. The boards bowed under them but held. A stale smell rose up, not the usual damp wood and old mold Jonah was used to. This scent was older, deeper, like air trapped for decades and furious about being disturbed. He tried to calm his nerves by focusing on the structure, testing the floor with his boot, jiggling the handle, pushing open the door. The hinges groaned like some wounded thing protesting their entrance. Inside, the house felt way bigger than it had from the outside, like the walls were cheating space. A narrow hall stretched forward, rooms breaking off both sides. Strips of wallpaper peeled down in curled ribbons, hanging like dead vines. A brittle lace curtain wavered in a window with no breeze at all. The air felt still, but somehow it moved. Every few seconds, Jonah felt the faintest shove against his skin, like the house was breathing out. They started in the living room. Marley swept her light across the walls. Old photos clung to what was left of the plaster. Faces blurred from years of moisture, but still there. One picture showed a man standing on the porch of this same house, leaning against the railing. Another showed two kids sitting on the floor with toys scattered around them, their expressions blank and stiff. Jonah tried to focus on the normal weirdness. Old photos, old dust, and not on the strangely steady creaks pulsing through the walls. At first, he chalked it up to typical house settling. Wind, temperature changes, all the usual excuses. But the sounds had rhythm. The boards under his boots would rise, just a fraction, then sink again. Wallpaper puffed outward, then relaxed. It wasn't random. It was slow, steady, deliberate. Like the house was taking its time, filling its lungs. "You feel that?" Marley whispered. Her hand hovered close to her chest. She didn't scare easy, but her voice was thin. Jonah nodded. "Old house shifting, that's all," he lied. The words tasted stupid. Their breath fogged in front of them, but the mist didn't match the strange rise and fall of the house. Their lungs and the buildings out of sync. They moved to the kitchen. Cabinets hung crooked, half ripped from the walls. The stove was a rusted husk. A pot sat on top, its contents fossilized into a dark smear. A metal sink had dropped from the counter, lying sideways like it had been shoved. But the table, that's what froze them. 4 mismatched chairs stood neatly tucked in. The surface was cleared except for one plate. On that plate sat a mound of dust and debris shaped uncannily like a piled meal, as if time had tried to recreate whatever used to sit there. Marley shuddered. "Upstairs," she said. "Let's check the bedrooms and go. This place is messing with my head." The staircase was narrow, steep, and the higher they climbed, the louder the breathing became. No mistaking it now. Wood stretching, releasing, swelling. The railing pulsed under Jonah's fingers. Halfway up, he pressed his hand to the wall and felt it push back. Not shifting, pushing. At the landing, the wallpaper changed, thick vines and leaves that made Jonah's eyes blur. 3 doors waited down the hall. They opened the first door. Small bedroom, nothing special. A busted bed frame in the corner, a dresser collapsed forward. A broken window letting in gray light. The air was stale and sweet in a rotten way. Every time Marley stepped forward, the floor responded, lifting slightly beneath her, then settling again. Like footsteps on a sleeping creature. The second bedroom hit harder. A child's bed frame with rusted springs. A shredded teddy bear on the floor, missing one eye. When Marley bent to pick it up, the entire room seemed to inhale. The wallpaper swelling, the springs rising, the boards beneath their feet bunching upward like muscle. "Drop it," Jonah whispered. She did. The house exhaled. Everything settled. But the message was clear. They'd crossed a line. Jonah wanted out. Right then. Right that second. But if he said it, Marley would push deeper out of pure stubbornness. So he kept his panic swallowed and said, "One more room, then we're gone." The last door was the only one closed. Paint blistered and cracked. Shallow scratches by the handle. Marley reached for it, hesitated, looked back. Jonah nodded, though his throat felt tight. She turned the knob. Cold air rushed out. Not moldy, not dusty, just empty, like the room had been vacuum sealed. Their lights hit the walls. And the carvings. From floor to ceiling, the plaster was etched with arcs and circles and lines. Hundreds of overlapping paths scratched deep by something sharp. At first it looked chaotic, but then patterns emerged. Clusters. Repeats. Like someone had traced the movement of something inside the walls. Over and over. For years. The house inhaled. Hard. The floor lifted so much, Jonah had to shift his stance. The walls bowed. The ceiling creaked like ribs strained to breaking. His ears popped. A sound slid through the room, air being dragged through a tight space. Not a voice, not words, but close enough to both that Jonah's skin crawled. Marley whispered his name. He stepped back. The house shoved upward beneath him, knocking him forward. His hand slapped the carved wall. It felt hot, alive, beating. He ripped his hand back. "We're leaving," he said. And for once, Marley didn't argue. Jonah and Marley eased backward down the hall, refusing to turn their backs on that room until they absolutely had to. The farther they got, the less pressure they felt in their ears. But the house didn't stop breathing. It just slowed, like some huge thing drifting toward sleep. The stairs creaked under their weight, but at least they felt like wood again, lifeless, solid, not pulsing. In the living room, just as they reached the doorway, the house pulled in one last long breath. The floor heaved, the walls bulged, the ceiling strained like it might snap. That almost voice slid through the room again, dragging air into something unseen. It shaped itself around a sound that could have been a word. Jonah didn't stick around long enough to find out. He grabbed Marley's arm and yanked her out onto the porch. The second their feet crossed the threshold, the pressure dropped. The cold outside hit their lungs like knives. The wind rushed back in with a roar they hadn't heard since before stepping inside. Birds started calling out in the trees, as if someone had turned the volume back up. Jonah hadn't realized how dead the world had gone around that house until the noise returned. They didn't run, but they moved fast across the leaf-covered hill, both of them refusing to look back. The porch sagged behind them. The dark windows stared without blinking. Neither spoke until the house vanished behind a twist of trees. Even then, silence clung to them for a while. They followed the faint trail toward the road, boots crunching quietly. Marley finally broke the quiet. "You felt that. All of it. Don't lie." Jonah nodded once. "Yeah. So what the hell was it?" He didn't answer for a long moment. He kept seeing the carved walls, feeling the heat of the plaster, hearing that slow inhale echo in his chest. He thought about the forest refusing to cross that yard, the way his own breathing had almost synced with the house, like his lungs wanted to match its rhythm. "I don't know," he said, and that was the truth. But it wasn't empty. They barely told anyone, and the few times they tried, their words came out thin and wrong. Their friends laughed, tossed out logical explanations, old beams settling, air pressure shifts, underground springs warping the foundation. Jonah didn't blame them. Before that day, he would have said the same stuff. Weeks rolled by. Then months. Life crept back in. Jobs, errands, family problems, the small everyday things that smother memories. But every now and then, on some late, still night, Jonah would lie awake and feel a strange pressure in his chest. His breathing would slow, matching that old rhythm he hoped he'd forgotten. Like something out in those hills was still inhaling, and his body remembered the pattern. He never went back to that hillside. Marley moved away about a year later. They kept in touch, kind of. A few texts, occasional calls, sharing pictures of new places they explored, always bright, always safe. Then one night, way past midnight, Jonah's phone buzzed. Marley had sent a single message. Sometimes my walls creak like that. I hate it. She never mentioned it again. Time kept grinding on. Abandoned places around their hometown slowly collapse each year, roofs caving in, vines swallowing porches, entire walls falling to rot. The mountain takes back what's hers, bit by bit. Jonah sometimes wonders if that house will ever fall, or if it'll just stay there, half buried in the hillside, its dark ribs stretching and contracting in the shadows. Breathing, waiting, listening for the next footsteps that dare cross its porch. Isabella had grown up hearing whispers about the widow's house long before she ever saw it herself. In her town, folks mentioned it only in hushed tones, a name dropped and then quickly buried under a change of subject. Legend had it that an old mountain widow kept a ledger, jotting down the names of everyone who crossed her path, and the way they'd die. Over the years, far too many deaths matched her entries, and the townspeople quit going near the place. When the widow disappeared, the house sat empty, untouched, as if the whole ridge silently agreed to ignore it. As a kid, Isabella treated the tales like ghost stories, nothing more. But once she started digging into local history for a small online project on Appalachian folklore, the widow's house kept surfacing. Every version was slightly different, but the core was always the same. The widow, the ledger, the deaths that followed. She wasn't the kind to let it linger as rumor. She wanted proof. A deed, a record, a house, something tangible she could hold. She tracked down the property in an old tax ledger, an unpaid listing from the 1970s. The owner's name matched the one locals still spoke in fearful respect. The description mentioned a small homestead at the end of a logging spur, past a fire road long gone. That was enough to go on. On a gray spring afternoon, she parked at the end of cracked asphalt and followed a narrow track winding up the ridge. The hike dragged longer than expected. Damp leaves and leftover rain stank the air. The forest was waking from winter, slow and wet. Her boots slid on moss-covered stones. Birds cried high in the trees, but near the ground, the woods were dead quiet. The path narrowed, then vanished entirely under ferns and brambles. She pushed through, letting the lay of the land guide her. Finally, she stepped into a small clearing. The house crouched at the far edge, half hidden by trees, trying to disappear. Smaller than she imagined, one story with a steep roof and rough stone chimney. The front porch sagged in the middle, boards silvered by time. Windows were grimy, looking painted over, and ivy clawed up the walls like spindly fingers. Isabella paused at the clearing's edge. No birdsong, no wind, nothing. Her skin prickled, her neck tightened. She had learned to trust this feeling. This wasn't just another abandoned farmhouse. The fear, grief, and anger of generations had seeped into the boards. She hesitated, knowing no one knew exactly where she was. If she slipped, if anything happened, it would be a long time before anyone found her. But the thought came with teeth. No one else would ever see it, or know if the stories were true. The porch groaned under her weight but held. The front door, cracked and rusted, turned with a dry click. A rush of cold, dusty air hit her, smelling faintly of old paper and dried flowers. Inside, the house was cleaner than she expected. Dust everywhere, cobwebs in corners, but nothing overturned. A table stood in the center, chairs pushed in, a rusting wood stove huddled in one corner. Shelves lined one wall with empty jars and a few faded books. She moved carefully, flashlight cutting across the low ceiling, darkened by years of smoke. No photos, no trinkets, nothing personal. The ledger, if it existed, wouldn't be out in the open. She checked shelves, then cupboards by the stove. Nothing but dust and broken dishes. A doorway led to a tiny bedroom, barely enough for the narrow bed and a chest of drawers. The bed was made, blanket pulled tight, like someone might return at any moment. The chest stuck when she tried it. Moisture had swollen the wood. She pushed hard. It jerked free violently. Inside, clothes folded meticulously. Plain dresses, a faded shawl once deep blue. No ledger, no hidden book. Her eyes drifted to the floor near the far wall. One plank didn't line up, its nailhead slightly off. She knelt, fingers tracing the edge. It shifted under her touch. Pulling her pocket knife, she pried it free. A shallow cavity lay beneath, just wide enough for one object. Her heart hammered as she reached in and lifted a small package wrapped in oilcloth. The cloth crackled, brittle at the corners. Carefully she unwrapped it. A dark, leather-bound ledger emerged, edges smoothed by touch. No title, only shallow grooves where fingers had traced the surface endlessly. She carried it back to the main room, set it on the table, and paused. Her breathing was loud in the silence. This was what she had come for. Proof, answers, or at least the story made tangible. The first pages looked mundane. Household accounts, deliveries of flour, sale of eggs. But a few pages in, the entries shifted. Names replaced goods. Notes beside them spoke of injuries, accidents, illness. Dates often preceded incidents by days or weeks. She flipped forward to the back third. Handwriting tightened, ink darker, lines closer together, fewer mundane notes. One surname caught her eye, written 3 times in a year. Each entry paired with a different first name, a different fate. She recognized the story, a family whose fortune had collapsed in brutal seasons. Her skin crawled. It could have been coincidence. Mountain lives were harsh. But these entries predated the events. She froze as her eyes fell on the last used pages. Near the end, an entry seemed newer. Ink darker, fresher. Date, 10 years ago. Surname, her own. Her stomach dropped. The house tilted around her. She read it again. Her name, neatly written in the same careful hand as all the others. She flipped the next page. No date, just continuation. Her surname and a single word. Settled. The pen had left faint indentations, numbers never filled in. Cold weight sank into her chest. She looked up. The house felt different, watchful. Every instinct screamed to take the ledger and run. Proof would make it history, document the curse, cement it beyond whispers. Her fingers brushed the leather. Pain shot through her palm, a thin cut opening as if she had touched glass, not worn leather. Edges of pages near the end were stained rusty brown. She wrapped the ledger in the oilcloth, trembling, and returned it to the cavity. Pressed the plank back flush. The house seemed to exhale, pressure lifting slightly. She left without looking back. The forest felt alive again, birds and wind rushing in like applause. Branches whipped at her arms as she raced down the ridge. Only at her car did she notice her palm throbbing, the cut still there. That night, she tried to write it all down. The house, the compartment, the ledger, her name inked in a stranger's hand. But when she reached the last page, the word settled, her pen refused to move. Her chest tightened. Days later, she checked obituaries obsessively. Nothing. Life went on, but a sense of unfinished business clung. Every near miss, a slip, a stumble, felt loaded, as if the world was ready to tip. She considered returning, documenting the ledger fully, turning the story into an article, maybe a book. But imagining herself there, feeling the air shift, Seeing her name inked by the widow crushed the idea. Some stories are meant to be told. Some belong left alone. Isabella wrote the widow's tale, softening it, leaving out names and dates, turning it into legend. She never mentioned the ledger. She never told anyone that as she left the ridge, she had looked back and seen a figure in the dark window, a thin, still outline, watching with patience that didn't belong to the living. Isabella didn't stop writing about Appalachian folklore, but the widow's story always lingered at the edges of her mind. She softened it for readers, stripping names and dates, framing it as legend, a ghost tale to entertain rather than terrify. But at night, alone in her apartment, the memory pressed against her chest like a weight she couldn't shrug off. The ledger haunted her thoughts. That sharp word, settled, and the blank date beside it refused to leave her mind. It was like the house itself had stamped a mark onto her, a quiet warning she could neither erase nor ignore. Every time she reached for a notebook, the pages seemed to hum with unspoken knowledge, the silence of the house echoing in her ears. She replayed her steps up the ridge again and again, the crunch of dead leaves under her boots, the forest swallowing the path, the way the house had crouched there, hidden and patient, the porch that groaned under her weight, the chill of the air that seemed to tighten around her shoulders the moment she touched the door. Each memory sharpened, vivid and raw, as if the ridge itself had seared them into her mind. Even simple things in life took on a sinister edge. A car braking too late at an intersection made her heart leap. A loose stone under her boot on a trail made her start. Anything that moved unexpectedly made her glance over her shoulder. The ledger had taught her to sense the world differently, to notice the subtle pressures, the weight of unseen attention. It was a paranoia born not of imagination, but of certainty. She considered returning for the ledger multiple times, to document every name, every date, to photograph the pages, to prove that the curse was more than a story. The academic in her screamed to gather evidence, but the instinct in her screamed louder to stay away. She couldn't shake the feeling that pulling it out again might change something, release whatever quiet patience waited in that house, awaken it fully, make it aware she had trespassed once more. Instead, she told the story carefully. She wove the widow into a mythic figure, a cautionary tale about old secrets in the mountains. She left out the ledger entirely, leaving the teeth of the story buried under the veil of folklore. Readers never knew the weight behind the words, the certainty she felt when standing in that room, staring at her own name in someone else's hand. The memory of the house sometimes crept into her dreams. She would find herself on the ridge, the trail swallowed by ferns and brambles, the air thick and wet with unseen breath. The house would be there, crouched and silent, waiting. She would touch the door and feel that same icy draft, hear the subtle creak of the floorboards, see the glint of the ledger peeking from its hollow. She'd wake with her heart hammering, hands shaking, convinced the house was still out there, watching. Months passed. She told herself she had escaped unscathed, that the ledger was hidden, the house sealed in memory. But a persistent chill followed her, subtle at first, a tightening in her chest, a prickling along her spine. It was like the ridge had left a shadow in her, one that bent the world slightly, making her doubt her safety even in familiar places. Isabella never returned to the ridge. The thought of standing in that room again, feeling the house's attention land on her, was unbearable. She avoided all isolated trails, all forgotten houses, all whispers of places left behind. Even the idea of photographing old homes or documenting local legends made her pause, her fingers itching with the memory of leather and ink, of pages pressed hard into her consciousness. And yet, the story of the widow's house remained with her. In articles, in blog posts, in lectures, she retold it as a legend, careful and cautious. She removed the ledger, the precise dates, her own name. It became a tale of warning, a story of a house best left alone. But the truth lurked behind every word, waiting in the spaces she refused to name. Occasionally, on quiet nights when the wind whispered through the trees and the house of her childhood memories felt distant, she thought about the ledger, about the pages she had lifted and returned. She thought about the word settled, about the empty date, about the meticulous hand that had written her into the story. And she wondered if the ledger, like the house itself, was patient, waiting, watching, counting. She never saw the figure again, but the certainty remained. Somewhere up that forgotten ridge, in a house the world pretended didn't exist, the widow's presence lingered, the ink's warning intact. And Isabella knew that while she had left the house behind, it had not left her. Years later, she told the story at a folklore convention, softened and framed as legend. Audience members shivered and whispered, imagining the widow, imagining the ledger, imagining the curse. She left out her own brush with it, never mentioned the final pages, never spoke of the word settled and her name beside it. The story worked as folklore, terrifying enough to thrill, safe enough to digest. But after the crowd had dispersed, when the lights dimmed and the room was silent, she would sometimes see it again in her mind's eye. The house tucked against the ridge, the window dark, a figure watching. Thin, still, patient. The kind of attention that belonged to the dead, or to something older, something that had learned to wait. Isabella never returned to the house. She kept writing, kept telling the tales, kept the ledger safely locked away in her memory. But she carried the weight of it with her, a subtle pressure, a cold certainty. Some stories were meant to be told. Some stories were meant to remain hidden. And some, she realized with a shiver she would never shake, followed you home, lying in wait for the moment you forgot to look behind you. The widow's house, the ledger, the word settled, all of it lingered in the shadows of her life. The house might have been empty, the forest might have reclaimed the ridge, but the story had marked her. And Isabella knew, deep in her bones, that some corners of the world, some old secrets in the mountains, could never truly be closed. She never wrote the ledger into her public stories. She never told anyone her name was written there. But sometimes, when the wind carried the scent of damp earth, or when shadows fell just so in a quiet room, she felt it. That same weight, patient and unblinking, reminding her that some stories wait for the living to come home, even when they think they've left them behind. And in that knowledge, she found both fascination and dread. A story alive, breathing in the dark, patient and watching, always watching. Davis had never trusted company houses. They always reeked of utility over life, like temporary shells slapped down on land the owners barely cared about. The one out on Briar Hollow Road was worse than most. Sitting at the end of a rough, rut-choked track, it hunched over the Appalachian foothills like it was ashamed to exist. The clapboard siding had faded to a sickly gray, the porch sagging under decades of winters and neglect. Locals whispered that a survey crew had used it back in the 70s when the state floated plans for a new ridge road. The road never materialized, and the crew? Gone, vanished before a single cut was made. Davis first heard about it from his uncle, a man who'd spent decades crawling back roads and logging trails, boots caked with mud and hands roughened by chainsaws. One night over a beer, his uncle mentioned the house in passing, then shut up, eyes distant. That silence was enough. "Everything's still there," the man said finally, voice low. "Like they stepped out for a smoke and never came back." The house had been listed as inactive state property for years, untouched and unassigned. Curiosity gnawed at Davis for months. He worked part-time at a small civil engineering firm, had access to dusty maps and survey plats. One gray, rainy afternoon, he found the old file for the abandoned Briar Hollow alignment. The house was marked Camp 3. Margins bore notes in spidery handwriting. Crew reassigned, no explanation. On another sheet, someone had underlined unresolved next to personnel status. That was enough. Saturday came overcast, sticky with low clouds. Davis drove down the faded logging road, deeper into the hills than he usually dared. Trees closed around him, high and oppressive, filtering what little light there was into permanent late-afternoon gloom. The track narrowed, ended at a crude turnaround overgrown with saplings. From there, a grassy lane begged to be walked. He shouldered his pack and followed it. The house came slowly, creeping from the trees like it was shy. A long, low rectangle, central door, 2 windows on either side. Simple, functional. The front steps had sunk, the porch bowed inward, but the roof held. No graffiti, no smashed bottles. It wasn't vandalized. It was left alone, preserved, and it made him uneasy. Davis paused at the clearing's edge, listening. The woods weren't silent, not exactly. A squirrel chattered high above. A crow cawed once, then nothing. Around the house, sound seemed swallowed, trapped. He stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned but held. The front door looked dull with tarnish. He twisted the knob. It turned far too easily, swinging open with a low, satisfied sigh. A wave of stale, dry air rolled out. Inside was like walking into a paused second. The main room stretched the length of the building. Hooks on the wall still held canvas jackets and hard hats. A long table dominated the center, cluttered with maps, mugs, and mechanical pencils. One mug had a ghost of a brown ring at its bottom. Coffee evaporated instead of poured out. On the far wall, a bulletin board sagged with curling topographic sheets, weather reports, typed memos. Davis stood just inside, taking it all in. No dust, no cobwebs. Floorboards scuffed, but no leaves, no pollen. Nothing to hint at decades of abandonment. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper. The house had been used recently in a way that made his skin crawl. He moved slowly to the table, careful not to disturb anything. Maps were marked in red and blue pencil. Probable alignments, soil notes, stream crossings. A surveyor's field book lay open. Last entry, July 18, 1974. The neat block letters detailed Ridgecrest Clearing and auditory interference from unknown source, cut off mid-word. The pencil that wrote it lay snapped beside the book, tip broken clean. His mouth went dry. Flipping back, he saw normal entries, azimuths, distances, benchmarks, weather notes. Only the last week's logs twisted into something else. Voices in timber during stakeout, no source seen. Footsteps counted, not matching head count. Advised to ignore, proceed on schedule. The tone, the shift, pressed uneasily against him. He left the book open and walked to the back. A short hallway led to 2 small bedrooms and a narrow kitchen. In the first bedroom, 3 metal-framed bunks lined the walls, mattresses thin but neat, olive blankets tucked in. Boots under beds, socks draped over nails. Second bedroom, 1 bunk, a duffel half-zipped, a paperback face down on a pillow. He picked it up, then set it exactly back, spine unbroken. Kitchen frozen too, dishes in the drying rack, a pot on the stove with a residue ring. A July 1974 calendar showing blank days after the 18th. Returning to the main room, his heartbeat thudded loud. The house creaked once, softly. No mold, no dust. Only faint coffee and old paper. The bulletin board caught his eye. Mundane memos, schedules, equipment requisitions. Bottom, a typewritten notice, yellowed but ink dark. Effective immediately. Suspend solo surveys beyond Station 47 until further notice. Complaints of echoed footsteps and extra voices recorded. No third-party interference found. Increased group movement recommended. Timeline unchanged. No signature, just initials. He stepped back, exhaling slowly. It felt like someone had just stepped out, waiting to return. Yet official records were stark. No crew transfer, no reassignment, just a line that might as well have read, "Gone." He needed perspective, to see the house from the outside, to make sense of the frozen air. A rear door opened onto a narrow stoop. Beyond, the land dropped sharply into a thick ravine. Faded orange paint on trees and rocks marked the old survey line, wooden stakes leaning or knocked over, disappearing into brambles. Inside, a metal filing cabinet beside the bulletin board yielded more maps and personnel forms. 5 men, 1 woman, all Camp 3. Bottom drawer stuck. Yanking it open, a folder slid free. A photocopied police report from 1974. Failure of crew to report Briar Hollow project. Officers found the camp intact, vehicles parked, no people on site. Report ended blandly. Ongoing investigation. No follow-ups. Davis realized his own breathing was loud in the silence. No insects. No scurrying mice. The quiet felt wrong. Not empty, full of listening. That was enough. He snapped a few quick photos. Main room, field book, bunk room. As he lined up the table, he heard it. A distinct click. Boot heel on wood from the hallway. Heart leapt. He turned. Empty hall, dark doorways. "Hello?" His voice swallowed immediately. No answer. He knew better. Last field book entry pressed against his mind. Extra footsteps in the hall. Panic bubbled, surged like tide. He slung his pack over his shoulder, inching toward the door, not turning his back on the hallway. And then, the hooks. 1 jacket missing. 3 jackets, 3 hats. Now 2 jackets, 2 hats, 1 helmet. He counted, recounted. Rationality thinned. He stepped outside, shut the door, the latch sliding with that same unnervingly smooth motion. Air felt lighter. Forest sounds returned, soft but present. The house vanished behind the trees quickly, but the feeling of being watched didn't. Pressure between his shoulder blades, an itch with no relief. Branches whispered against him, shadows seemed to move on their own. For a long time in the car, he sat with the engine off, hands gripping the wheel, heart finally settling, and promised himself he'd never go back. Months crawled by. Davis kept the scans and the police report tucked in a metal box under his bed, labeled Briar Hollow Camp 3. He printed the field book pages, lined them neatly, touched them as little as possible. When the state announced a push to inventory unused properties, the Briar Hollow house appeared on the list. A single note in the public report snagged his attention. Structure inspection deferred, no access gained. He read it again and again like a code. Someone had gone up there and either couldn't enter or chose not to. Either way, the house had stayed untouched, its secrets intact. He never went back. When friends asked about strange places in the mountains, he sometimes mentioned a company house frozen in time, where coffee never cooled and boots never gathered dust. He kept the details hazy, letting the story hover in the shadows. When pressed, he'd shrug. Sometimes people don't leave a place. Sometimes a place keeps them. Doesn't matter if anyone ever finds a body. At night, when the wind slid down off the ridge and rattled his windows, the memories clawed at him. He'd dream of the main room at Camp 3, the weak bulb overhead flickering. The field book lay open, pencil unbroken. He could hear it, soft, patient footsteps in the hallway. He didn't need to see them. He knew the crew was coming back, finally returning to wherever they had been wandering along that unfinished survey line, and bringing with them the thing that had been moving just out of sight. The memory of that click, sharp and crisp on the wooden floor, haunted him. He replayed it over and over, every sound in the house sharpened in his mind. The groan of the porch, the sigh of the front door, the whisper of the wind outside mixing with the frozen stillness inside. He could feel the hooks on the wall, feel the emptiness where the jacket had vanished. His gut churned at the thought, at the sudden absence in a place that hadn't changed otherwise. The air had been held in a grip tighter than any living person could muster. He thought about the field book endlessly. The last entries, the mid-word cutoff, the snapped pencil. He pictured the crew working as normal, then the voices in the timber, footsteps that didn't belong. His chest tightened, remembering the red and blue pencil marks, the annotations of probable alignments and stream crossings, innocent on the surface, but heavy with something else beneath. It wasn't just a house, not just a survey camp. It was a trap, a memory frozen, an imprint of vanished people. Even in daylight, he'd catch himself imagining the place. Walking trails near the ridge, he'd glance at every tree, every fallen log, half expecting to see one of the jackets hanging, waiting. The woods felt thicker, the air slower. The memory of that quiet, unnatural silence pressed against him every time he passed a shadow. The forest wasn't just alive, it was holding its breath, watching, waiting. Davis tried to bury the obsession. Work, errands, friends, he went through the motions. But every small noise, footsteps behind him on a wooden floor, a gust that rattled windows, the scraping of branches against siding, made his pulse spike. He'd freeze, heart hammering, straining to listen. Was it real? His mind whispered yes, and he didn't argue. He had felt the weight of a house that wasn't empty, had smelled stale coffee, seen papers arranged as if someone could walk back in any second. The most vivid dreams came when he was dead tired, shoulders dragging, head heavy. In the dream, the main room glowed under a flickering bulb. The field book sat open on the table, pencil ready, and footsteps came down the hall, steady and deliberate. The crews were back, 5 men, 1 woman, and the air shifted with their presence. They moved silently, sliding past bunks, checking the kitchen, straightening the mugs. The details were perfect, exact. He could hear their boots click softly on the boards, feel the heavy, unyielding quiet following behind them. Sometimes he'd wake with his hands shaking, heart roaring in his chest, the ghost scent of coffee and old paper thick in his nostrils. Shadows in his apartment seemed too solid, too deliberate. He could swear he heard the soft scrape of furniture, the pull of drawers, the click of something unseen following him. And every time, his mind drifted back to Camp 3, to that house at the end of Briar Hollow Road where the field book waited, and the air felt alive. Davis never told anyone the real truth. The field book, the police report, the lost crew, he carried it alone. The thought of sharing it made the hair on his neck stand up. What would they say? Some would scoff, call it coincidence, call it exaggeration. But he knew better. That house had a memory, a hunger even, and he'd been inside. He'd seen the traces, smelled the residue of what had lingered, touched the snapped pencil. He knew that the place wasn't just history. It was alive in its own dark way. Even now, long after the trip, he could feel it. The pressure of unseen eyes on his back, the unnatural quiet in the woods, the soft, certain click of boots echoing down an empty hallway. The house, the field book, the vanished crew, they all existed together, somewhere just beyond reach. And sometimes, when the wind ran sharp across his windows, Davis swore he heard the table shift, the pencil roll, the faint whisper of voices walking slowly down the hall, finally returning to the place where time had stopped. The knowledge settled in his chest like lead. Camp 3 was real. The people who had gone there hadn't just disappeared, they had been claimed, absorbed into the house's slow, patient memory. And though Davis had left, had locked the door behind him, had fled down the fading trail, he understood fully. Leaving didn't end it. That house would keep counting, keep waiting, keep watching. And every time he closed his eyes, every time he wandered too close to the ridge, he felt the pull. The crew was still there, still moving in the shadows just out of sight, following the unfinished survey line, stepping quietly behind him, and he would never forget the soft click that started it all. It wasn't just a company house anymore. It was a trap, a living echo of absence. The walls had ears, the floors had memory, and the field book remained, open and patient, waiting for the next set of footsteps. Davis knew it in his bones. Some places don't let go. Some places never let anyone leave. George and Millie had burned through decades in the city, scraping and scrimping every month, chasing something that felt like it could last. When the money finally piled up enough for a down payment, they wanted more than bricks and walls. They wanted land, space, silence. When the listing for the Ashwood Ridge house popped up, it checked every box. 2 acres, a stretch of mountains you could stare at for hours, 3 bedrooms, and a price so low it almost made them laugh in disbelief. The real estate agent dodged questions about the history, muttering something about previous owners vanishing fast and the place sitting empty for years. George and Millie didn't push. They were too busy imagining themselves on that ridge, building a home they could finally call their own. The house itself was older than the photo suggested, built in the 50s, with later additions tacked on like afterthoughts. Still, the frame was solid, the location perfect. Halfway up a tree-choked ridge, no neighbors in sight. They closed in early fall, hauling a truckload of hand-me-down furniture and plotting renovations room by room. The first weeks were all scrubbing, painting, ripping up old carpet, cleaning decades of grime from the kitchen. It felt alive, like they were shaping something together. The locked door upstairs didn't seem to matter at first. It sat at the end of the hall, wedged between the bathroom and the master bedroom. The key the agent gave them worked for every other lock, but this one refused. George shrugged it off. Maybe the old owners lost it. Maybe something valuable got locked in and forgotten. He'd call a locksmith eventually, but leaks, broken windows, and a rotting porch step needed attention first. Millie was the first to notice the hinges. She had gone upstairs to measure the spare room for curtains and froze in the hall, staring at the door. "George," she called down, "come check this out." He found her crouched at the frame, fingertips tracing the cold metal. The hinges were mounted outside, not inside. George frowned, slow to catch it. Then it hit him. A door locked from the outside isn't meant to keep people out. It's meant to keep people in. "Maybe it's just a storage room," Millie said, though her tone didn't carry conviction. "A pantry, maybe." George didn't answer. He pressed his palm to the wood, thin, ordinary, but the hinges were industrial grade, screws sunk deep into the frame. Someone had wanted that door shut. The locksmith came the next day, eyebrow raised but silent as he drilled out the cylinder and replaced it with a new lock. When the latch clicked and the key turned, George felt a tug of hesitation, a flicker of dread telling him to stop, to leave it sealed. But Millie was already pushing the door open. Inside, the room was small, 10 by 10 roughly. A single window was nailed shut under a heavy curtain. The air hit colder than the rest of the house, stale and biting. The walls were beige, institutional, washed out. A narrow twin bed sat in the center, mattress long gone, springs rusted. A small wooden chair huddled in the corner. Nothing else.
Millie stepped in first, her footsteps sharp on the bare boards. George hung near the door, feeling the air thicken. The locksmith glanced in, then busied himself with packing tools, eyes avoiding the room.
"Look at the paint," Millie murmured. She knelt near the window wall, tracing shallow, deliberate scratches across the plaster. Some formed stick figures, a crooked sun, letters or initials. George moved to the opposite wall. The marks here were thicker, arranged in clusters that looked like a crude calendar. Rows of vertical scratches grouped in fives. He counted 73. 73 days, if that's what they tracked. Near the bottom of the wall by the door, gouged deep into the drywall, someone had carved a single word. Millie recoiled, hand over her mouth. "We need to know who lived here." The locksmith was already heading out, toolbox in hand. When George asked about payment, the man shook his head, mumbling that he'd mail an invoice. He didn't look back as he left. That night, George sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, diving into the previous owners. County property records revealed Gerald Fisk and his wife, owners from 1998 to 2015. A quick search turned up a local news snippet from 2014. Gerald charged with child endangerment. The story was brief, clinical. The address matched. He'd been convicted for unlawful confinement of a minor and sentenced to 18 months. Case sealed due to the child's age. George reread the details 3 times. The scratches, the calendar, the word carved in the plaster. They fit together in a sick, impossible puzzle. 73 days, maybe more. He didn't know when it started or ended. Millie came down, sat across from him. "We should cover it," she said softly. "Seal it. Make it a storage room." George nodded, though the weight in the air didn't lighten. It felt different now, heavier, like the room itself knew they had learned its secret. They tried. Primer, paint, 2 thick coats of white over the walls. Boxes moved in, stacked neatly. The door stayed closed. For weeks it almost worked. The room became just another space in the house. But the sound began in late October. At first, faint, a soft scratching from upstairs, just past midnight. George would lie awake, convincing himself it was branches scraping siding, maybe an animal. But it was too deliberate. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause. Always from the locked room. Millie woke him one night, hand clamped tight on his arm. "Do you hear that?" He did. The scratching had grown heavier, more urgent, like furniture scraping across the floor. He grabbed a flashlight, climbed the stairs. The hallway was dark, the air sharp enough to see his breath. He stood outside the door. Silence. Boxes untouched, walls smooth and white. But the chill was bone deep, making his teeth ache. He backed out, locking the door. Millie hugged herself at the top of the stairs. "Anything?" she asked. "No," he muttered, voice shaking. The sounds didn't stop. Some nights nothing. Other nights scratching started after midnight, hours long.
Once, George thought he heard a child whispering, muffled, behind the door. He tried to reason it away, but Millie heard it too. They asked neighbors about the Fisks. An older woman stiffened at the name. "That man was a monster," she said bluntly. "Kept his stepson locked up for months. Kid was 8, 9. No school, no doctors. Someone finally called after hearing him cry through a window." Her look carried pity. "You bought that house?" George nodded. She shook her head and changed the subject. Millie wanted out. She began looking at rentals, talking about breaking the mortgage, leaving it all behind. George resisted at first. They had poured everything into this place. But after waking one night to the locked door wide open, boxes shoved aside, fresh gouges in the white walls, he stopped arguing. They listed the house that spring. The first agent refused to touch it. The second warned it would linger on the market. She was right. Months passed, no offers. Tourists came, left immediately, silent. One couple asked if anyone had died there. George told part of the truth. They left. Eventually, a developer made a low, sight-unseen offer, intending to bulldoze the house and carve the land into lots. George and Millie accepted immediately. They left before the sale closed, taking only what fit in their car. The house came down in late autumn. George drove by months later. Cleared land, survey stakes marking future lots. Relief flickered, shallow. At night, in their new apartment across the state line, George sometimes hears it. A faint, rhythmic scratching, patient and unyielding, echoing from somewhere he can't see. He wonders every time if some things never stay behind, no matter how far you run. The locked room had become a shadow in their lives. Even with paint thick and fresh over the walls, even with boxes stacked neat and heavy, the house whispered at night. George would lie awake, hearing the soft scrape of nails, or maybe claws, on the plaster. Millie didn't go upstairs after dark. She stayed huddled near him on the couch, blanket tight around her, eyes wide in the low lamplight. The scratches returned, always from that room. Sometimes faint, a rhythm too deliberate to be wind or loose siding. Scratch, pause. Scratch, pause. The sound had a patience to it, a slow, measured cruelty. Once, in the dead hours, George swore he heard a child's voice, small and muffled, almost pleading. He tried to convince himself it was the wind, the house settling, an echo of the Fisk's story that had seeped into his imagination. But Millie had heard it too. And after that night, the fear became mutual, a living thing that slinked between them like smoke. Neighbors weren't much help. A few lived a mile or more down the ridge. Casual inquiries about the Fisks sent a chill through the old-timers. One elderly woman froze when they mentioned the name. Her eyes went cold, her voice clipped. "That man, he was a monster," she said. "Kept his stepson locked up for months. Kid was maybe 8, 9. No school, no doctors. Just crying in a room with a locked door. Someone finally called it in after hearing him through the window." Her stare lingered on George, pity laced with horror. "You bought that house?" George swallowed. He had. He wished he hadn't. Millie pressed for leaving. She scoured rental listings, talked of breaking the mortgage, leaving everything behind. George resisted at first. They'd sunk everything into the house, sweat and money, hope and dreams. But their resolve broke the night they woke to the sound of the locked door, wide open, boxes knocked aside, and the faint scraping of fresh scratches gouged into the white walls. That was it. They stopped arguing. Spring came, and with it, the listing. The first agent refused to touch it. The second reluctantly agreed, warning that it would linger unsold for months.
The warning was accurate. Tours yielded no buyers. The few who entered left quickly, wordless and uneasy. One couple even asked outright if anyone had died there. George told them a sliver of the truth. They left, silent. Eventually, a developer came along, offering a low price, sight unseen, planning to tear the house down and split the land into new lots. George and Millie accepted. They packed what they could into their car, leaving the rest behind. The house was demolished in late autumn, and for a moment, George felt relief. He drove past the cleared ridge months later. Just stumps, survey stakes, and the promise of future lots. But the relief was thin, brittle. At night, when Millie slept beside him in their new apartment across the state line, he still heard it. The faint scratching, deliberate and patient, from a place he couldn't see. It didn't stop, didn't tire. It lingered in the corners of the quiet, in the shadows at the edge of the light. George sometimes imagined it wasn't even tied to the house anymore. That some things, horror, memory, cruelty, don't vanish with walls and roofs. They follow. They burrow into the mind, into the quiet moments when you think you're safe. The scratching, he realized, might never stop. Even months later, he could picture the twin bed frame, the narrow, springy mattress stripped away, the small chair shoved in a corner. He could feel the chill from the sealed room, like the cold had seeped into his bones. A warning, or a remnant of the trapped boy's fear. He remembered the calendar scratches, the single word gouged into the drywall, and the industrial hinges on that door. Hinges that had meant to hold someone, or something in place. Sometimes he dreamt of the room. He saw the walls bare, the air thick and icy. Boxes moved aside on their own. The door stood half open, waiting. The pencil marks and scratches reappeared, fresh despite the paint. And in the hallway, faint but undeniable, came the rhythm of small, deliberate steps, walking just out of reach. Footsteps echoing against the bare boards. Millie would wake him, her body tense, whispering about shadows creeping in corners. But even when she slept, George could feel it. The house, or what had been in it, had etched itself into their lives, deeper than walls, deeper than floors. The fear was now part of him, stitched into his reflexes. A sudden noise in the dark, the creak of a floorboard, the scratch of a nail against plaster, and his body remembered Ashwood Ridge. He could never tell if it was the boy, or the anger, or something else entirely, something older, something patient, that had remained behind. All he knew was that the room had been alive, and though the house was gone, the imprint of it wasn't. He had carried it with him, like a scar. Even now, George sometimes swears he hears the faint, deliberate scratching when the apartment is silent, when the city hum fades into nothing, when the night presses close and still. And when that sound creeps into his ears, he knows. Some things follow you, no matter how far you run, no matter how high you climb, no matter what walls you build around yourself. They stay, patient, waiting, watching. Millie sleeps beside him, oblivious, or pretending to be, but George knows better. That room, those walls, that fear, it didn't die with the house. It came with them. It had learned their rhythm, their steps, their habits. It lingered, a ghost tethered not to a structure, but to memory, to terror, to the knowledge that some doors are never meant to open, and some doors, once opened, never truly close. And so George waits, tense in the dark, listening for the soft, steady scrape, knowing it could start any night, any time, calling out from somewhere he can't see, reminding him that some things don't stay behind. The scratching continues, patient,
always patient. Riley always acted like she loved wandering around on her own. Made her feel like she had an edge, like she was tougher than the girl who still kept a cheap plug-in nightlight glowing whenever the wind howled around her tiny third-floor apartment. She told herself that sneaking into forgotten houses scattered along the Appalachian backroads was just a hobby, a way to mix photography with her thing for old architecture. But the truth? She liked the quiet. Old houses didn't talk. They didn't poke at her, didn't expect anything from her. They just stood there, sagging under the weight of other people's ghosts, letting her walk through what was left of them. The day she found that windowless room started like any other run. Late fall, gray sky pressing low. The air smelled like wet dirt and cold rain waiting its turn. A buddy had mentioned an abandoned miner's house hidden somewhere off a service road up in the hills. Riley figured she'd check it out. She parked where the pavement gave up and turned into something closer to a broken trail. Climbed out, swung her backpack up, and followed a thin deer path into the woods. The house appeared between the bare trees like it had been dropped there and forgotten. One side sat almost buried where the hill leaned into it. A busted sofa gutted by raccoons. A lamp snapped in half. Wallpaper peeling in long curls. A narrow hall led deeper in, doorways on both sides. She took her time, snapping photos, capturing little details. The pattern of an old rug. A kid's shoe buried under dust. Pencil lines on a wall showing someone's height years ago. Nothing special. Just the usual heaviness old houses carried. She found the kitchen next. Cabinets hanging crooked. A sink rusted through so bad the bottom was gone. Broken glass sprinkled the floor like sharp glitter. The back door opened onto nothing, just a steep drop where stairs used to be. Only splintered remnants stuck out from the foundation. She moved on. The hallway tightened as she walked deeper. Felt like walking down a throat. Walls closer, ceiling lower. Two small bedrooms sat on either side. One had a metal bed frame propped against the wall. The other had a wardrobe with the mirror cracked into a spider web of warped reflections. Then, at the very end of the hall, she found the room. At first, she didn't get why it bothered her. The door looked normal. Same flaky beige paint as everywhere else. She turned the knob. It stuck, scraped, then gave. Cold air slid out and tapped her face, like cold fingers brushing her skin. She swept the beam of her flashlight inside and stepped through. The place was perfect. Too perfect. A clean, rectangular box. Most old houses bent, warped, slumped. But this room felt razor precise. Straight boards, sharp corners, low ceiling, no window. Every other room had at least one, broken, filthy, boarded, whatever, but something. Here, nothing. Just solid walls, smooth, bare. No sign a window had ever been there. Her flashlight made the white paint look gray.
She walked across the empty floor, her footsteps way too loud. Each step echoed strangely, like the sound didn't know where to go. She moved along the edges, running her fingers lightly over the walls. Cold, smooth, way smoother than the crumbling paint in the rest of the place. Then she noticed something else. Silence. Not the kind outside. This was heavier. Wrong. In every other room she'd heard the wind, the trees creaking, a bird somewhere. In here, those sounds died at the doorway. The air felt padded, thick. She could hear her own pulse. She blew out a slow breath and saw a faint wisp of vapor float through her flashlight beam. The room was colder than the rest of the house. Not freezing, just untouched. Like the sun hadn't touched it in decades. She told herself it was just a weird storage room. Maybe somebody patched over a window ages ago. That would explain the walls. The quiet. Old insulation, old plaster, nothing spooky. But a thin line of dread wound around her ribs. She looked back at the door. It seemed farther than it had been. Not by much, but enough to make her throat tighten. No way. The room wasn't big. 4 steps, maybe 5 across. She backed up until her shoulders touched the opposite wall, then reached her arm forward, eyeing the doorway. Just a normal rectangle of shadow. The hallway beyond barely lit. Still, it felt like if she walked toward it, it might slide away from her. Like distance wasn't playing fair. Her fingers tingled. She whispered, "Just take the pics and bounce." Bad idea. Her voice hit the walls and came back dull and flat, swallowed up before it could echo. She lifted her camera and snapped shots, wide ones first, then corners, floor, ceiling, walls. The tiny clicking of the lens sounded huge in the muffled air. Time got blurry. She didn't know how long she'd been in there. The light at the bottom of the door didn't help. It always looked the same. Dim, drained. The door seemed even farther now. Not a lot. Just enough to make her chest clamp up. She told herself she was done. She forced herself to walk toward the door. It took 5 steps. She knew it should have taken 3. She grabbed the knob. Ice cold. Too cold. It didn't turn at first. Panic shot through her like a live wire. She twisted harder, muscles tight. Then the knob gave. The door swung open with a long, tired sigh. Sound crashed back into her. The house creaked. Leaves murmured outside. A crow screamed somewhere above the roof. She stepped into the hall, exhaling hard. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. The air felt warm again, normal. She told herself she was leaving. But underneath that thought was a quiet tug. A pull. Like the room wasn't done with her. She stopped in the front room and glanced back. The door looked harmless. She lifted her camera, zoomed in, framed the door dead center, and took a shot. She didn't look at the preview. Didn't want to. She turned the camera off and let it hang heavy against her chest. The walk back through the woods felt off. Every twig snap made Riley twitch. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps pacing just out of view. She kept checking over her shoulder, half expecting to see that sagging house creeping closer through the trees, its roofline sliding between the bare branches like it had followed her. But the woods stayed the woods. Mud, leaves, distance, the faint hum of a far-off highway. Normal. Safe. Which somehow made everything worse. Back home that night, she dumped her gear on the floor and plugged her camera into her laptop. She told herself she was being dramatic. Fine. She'd look at the shots, sort them, and go to bed. Easy. She clicked through the first batch: living room wreckage, busted sofa, peeling wallpaper. Kitchen ruins. The little bedrooms with their cracked mirror and old bed frame. Nothing strange. Then she hit the pictures from the windowless room. Her hand paused over the trackpad. She inhaled once, slow, then clicked. The first image looked how she expected: an empty box of a room. Her flashlight beam hitting the far wall. Cold, bare. Wrong, but familiar. She clicked again, and again. On the fourth photo, her stomach flipped. It wasn't something obvious. The room just looked longer, like the far wall had drifted back a foot or two when she wasn't watching. The floorboards, straight in the earlier shots, now angled inward, pulling her eyes toward the center of the frame. She frowned, checked the file details. All taken within a minute. No zoom changes, no setting tweaks. She clicked to the last one. Her pulse punched hard against her ribs. The whole room looked stretched, like someone had grabbed the walls and pulled. The doorway behind her, barely visible on the edge of the frame, looked thinner. Its lines curved inward like they were being sucked into something deeper. The walls bowed the tiniest bit. Not like a collapsing house, more like something breathing. She sat back and pressed both hands against her jeans, grounding herself. "It's a lens glitch," she muttered. "A shake, some weird light bend." But even as she said it, she knew she didn't believe it. She snapped her laptop shut and killed the lights to go to bed. Halfway to her room, she stopped. She felt ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Still, she walked to her bedroom wall, pressed her palm flat against it, and waited. Just for a second. Nothing happened. No cold breath. No distant thump. No sense of space bending under her hand. Just her old drywall, slightly cool, slightly rough. Traffic murmured outside. Someone downstairs had their TV too loud. Everything normal. She lay in bed, staring into the dark until her eyes ached. Sleep came slow. Over the next few weeks, Riley found herself dodging tight, windowless spaces. Elevators set her nerves on fire. Hallways with no natural light made her skin crawl. Interior offices felt like traps. She stopped exploring alone, claimed she was busy, said winter made travel miserable, told friends that abandoned places all looked the same after a while. She didn't delete the photos, though. She shoved them into a folder tucked behind other folders, buried deep. Every so often, usually on nights when the city outside felt too still, she'd think about that smooth, cold air on her face, about how the room swallowed sound, about how the distance between her and the door kept shifting like it had a mind of its own. She thought about those walls. Perfect. Blank. Waiting. She wondered if the room had really been empty, or if it had been holding its breath, waiting for someone, maybe her, to stay just a little longer, long enough to learn what it was really for. And sometimes, late at night, when her apartment seemed too quiet, she'd swear the walls felt a little closer than usual. She'd roll onto her back, stare into the dark, and hope she'd imagine it. Because she knew one thing for sure. If the room had wanted her, really wanted her, it wouldn't have let go so easily. Harry, Rosie, and Poppy had been chasing abandoned spots since high school. By their early 20s, they had a rhythm. Always stick together, always tell someone where they were headed, never linger past sundown. Those rules had kept them safe through barns, shuttered churches, and houses rotting along Appalachian back roads. But the place on Kettle Ridge tested everything they'd learned. When they left, all three knew some buildings weren't empty because of age or neglect. They were empty for a reason.
Poppy had spotted the house on an old surveyor's map in the county records office. It squatted at the bottom of a steep hollow, only reachable by a trail winding through thick trees and a long, dry creek bed. The map listed it as a two-story with a partial basement, built in the 1890s and last lived in around the early 2000s. In the margin, a handwritten warning caught their eyes. Structural collapse, lower level flooded, approach with caution. That kind of note meant something worth seeing. They started hiking early on a late September Sunday. The air was sharp with pine and wet earth. The trail was overgrown but still passable, marked by old stacks of stones that had survived years of weather. It took nearly an hour to reach the hollow, where trees thinned and the ground leveled into a small clearing. The house waited there, leaning like it was tired, the back roof caved in. The porch had entirely collapsed, leaving jagged posts like broken teeth. "Looks worse than I thought," Rosie muttered, adjusting her pack straps.
She was the cautious one, always first to suggest turning back if her gut said no. Harry shrugged, stepping over the porch wreckage. "We hiked all the way down here. Let's at least see the inside." Poppy followed, camera in hand, snapping photos of peeling paint and the gray, exposed wood beneath. Most windows were shattered, their frames jagged, and the front door sagged at an angle, one hinge torn loose. Harry nudged the door open. The smell hit immediately. Not just mold or rot, but something heavier, wetter, like breathing near a stagnant pond. The front room was a wreck. Collapsed beams, waterlogged furniture. A staircase led up to the second floor, its steps warped and missing in patches. To the right, a narrow doorway descended into darkness.
"Basement," Harry said, flashlight cutting through the gloom. Stone walls slick with moisture, stairs plunging steeply before disappearing into shadow.
"That's the flooding they warned about." Rosie leaned closer, peering down. "Why dig a basement this deep? Looks like it drops 2 stories. Poppy crouched at the top, her light joining Harry's. Old houses like this sometimes had root cellars, maybe a cistern, maybe even a hidden spring. The air rising from below was cold, thick with that same organic stench. Harry took the first step down, testing the stones. They held. One hand pressed against the wall, the other steadied his flashlight. Rosie and Poppy followed, their footsteps echoing off the rough stone. The stairs were uneven, carved roughly, smoothed by decades of water and use. Halfway down, green algae slicked the walls, glistening in their lights. The smell thickened, almost tasting of rot. Harry wrinkled his nose but pressed on.
At the bottom, the basement opened into a low chamber stretching into darkness.
Water pooled in the center, perfectly still, reflecting their lights like black glass. The floor submerged near the far walls, stairs they descended ending just above the water. Rotten shelves clung to the far wall, their contents long gone. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Rosie whispered, staying near the stairs. Harry edged closer to the water's surface, light skimming across the pool. It was roughly circular, about 15 feet wide, filling the lowest part of the basement. He knelt, shining his beam into the dark, trying to see the bottom. The light vanished a few feet down, swallowed by the blackness. Then came the sound. A soft, wet scrape, like something heavy dragging over stone underwater. All three froze. Harry swept the light across the surface. Nothing. Still as glass. "What was that?" Poppy breathed. Before anyone could answer, it came again. Louder, deliberate, like some creature pulling itself along the submerged floor. Harry stepped back, pulse hammering, flashlight trembling. The water rippled near the center, spreading slow, lazy circles outward. Rosie grabbed Poppy's arm, pulling her toward the stairs. Harry's gaze locked on the water. The ripples grew, more agitated. The scraping was joined by a low, rattling breath, forced, labored, air moving through a throat that wasn't made for breathing. "We need to go," Rosie hissed. Harry nodded, eyes still fixed. Near the submerged steps, something pale broke the surface. At first it looked like debris. Then it moved. Slick, glistening, pale skin stretched over something angular. Fingers appeared first, long, jointed too many times, nails ragged and broken. The hand gripped the edge of a step, pulled. More of the arm emerged, water streaming off it. Limbs bent at impossible angles, joints bulging under translucent skin. Harry stumbled back. Flashlight beam jittering, the hand flexed, splayed, then slipped beneath the surface without a splash. They didn't speak. They ran. Stairs slippery, treacherous. Behind them, the wet dragging sounds quickened. Rosie hit the top first, gasping. Poppy almost tripped over broken boards. Harry slammed the basement door behind him, bracing against it. A dull, wet thud hit the other side. Another impact, harder. Rosie and Poppy yanked him away. They bolted for the front exit, leaving lights and cameras behind. Outside, the air was shockingly clean. They scrambled up the trail, branches whipping, boots slipping. Halfway up they stopped, chests heaving. "What the hell was that?" Poppy whispered. Harry shook his head. No clue. Rosie's hands trembled. It was waiting. They hiked the rest in silence, the memory replaying. The hand, the sound, the deliberate movement. It left no room for reason. When they hit the main road, Harry glanced back. Trees thick, house gone from sight. But the presence lingered. "We don't talk about this," Rosie said. Poppy nodded. Harry hesitated, then agreed. They never went back. Years passed. Poppy quit exploring entirely, claiming she'd lost her taste for it. Rosie moved out of state, avoiding the mountains altogether. Harry stayed, but he steered clear of back roads, hidden hollows, and forgotten trails. The gaps on maps where locals whispered things shouldn't be touched. Still, some nights the memory clawed back. Rain drumming on his roof could conjure the black water of that basement. The pale hand gripping the step, curling, twisting wrong. And the wet, rattling breath that had followed them as they fled. One night, browsing online, Harry stumbled across a news piece. A team of state inspectors had been sent out to evaluate old structures for environmental hazards. The house on Kettle Ridge was on their list. According to the report, the basement had been sealed off due to structural instability and groundwater contamination. Inspectors noted evidence of animal nesting and unusually high methane levels, speculating these could explain the strange sounds and reported sightings. The property was slated for demolition. Harry read it twice. He closed his laptop and tried to swallow the official line. Maybe the shadows were tricks, the water ripples just reflections, animals disturbed by their presence. He wanted to believe it, but he knew better. He had watched the fingers curl, heard that forced, wet breath from something that should not have been breathing. 6 months later, the house was torn down. The hollow sat empty, slowly being swallowed by trees and undergrowth. But Harry never shook the memory. On nights when wind roared down from the ridges and trees whispered, he wondered if tearing it down had truly ended it. Could a place like that ever be destroyed? Or did some things just burrow deeper, waiting in the wet dark for the next person foolish enough to descend those stairs and shine a light into the water? Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it. The pale hand, impossibly long, bending at wrong angles, clawing toward the light. He remembered the pool, perfect and still, swallowing every beam. He remembered the scraping and the rattle of breath in the stone darkness, something alive and aware beneath the water. Even when he tried to rationalize it, his mind refused. There was no animal that moved like that. No reflection, no shadow, no logical explanation. The memory had weight. It pressed into him, cold and damp. A reminder that some places carried their own kind of life, slow, patient, and utterly alien. Though time passed, the image stayed fresh. Harry avoided basements, abandoned homes, even the safe ones. He steered clear of hollowed trails and forgotten hollows, never straying from well-traveled roads. Poppy and Rosie had cut their ties completely. He alone carried the memory like a scar, raw and constant. Years later, when storms rolled through the ridges, he could feel it. Rain hammering, wind moaning, the sound of water pattering against roofs, it transported him back. He could see the black pool, the hand breaking the surface, the way it moved with deliberate care. And the sound, oh, that wet, dragging, rattling breath, that echoed in his mind as clearly as the first night. He sometimes wondered if demolition had really mattered, if the hollow had truly emptied, or if the thing had simply burrowed deeper, waiting, patient, for the next foolhardy explorers to step too far, to peer too deep, to shine light into black water that wanted to be left alone. Harry never returned to Kettle Ridge. He never stepped inside another abandoned house. But in quiet moments, when the world was still and the night pressed in, he could feel the pull. The memory wasn't just in his mind, it was in the air, in the damp, dark corners, in the pulse of the wind through the trees. He imagined it waiting somewhere in the hollow, just beneath the surface, under the water, coiled and alert, biding its time for the next intruder. And he knew, with a certainty that froze him from the inside, that some things don't die. Some things don't fade. They wait. They watch. And when the right person comes along, they reach out. Harry moved on, built a life elsewhere, far from the mountains. But Kettle Ridge never left him. Every heavy rain, every storm that rattled his windows, every whisper of wind through the trees reminded him. That hand, that sound, that deliberate, waiting intelligence. The hollow sat empty now, forest creeping over it. The house was gone. The debris buried, washed away, or decayed. But Harry knew the truth. Destruction didn't mean the end. Some places, some things, linger. They don't vanish. They hide. They wait. And the next time a flashlight beam cuts into black water, some lurking thing might just decide it's time to remind the world that it's still there. Kettle Ridge was gone from maps and memory for most. But not for Harry. The hollow, the house, the hand in the water. It stayed with him. In the shadows, in the rain, in the quiet moments when nothing else was awake. He had seen it. He had heard it. And he had run from it, knowing that in the dark, wet depths of a forgotten basement, something patient and terrible was still alive. And maybe, just maybe, it had been waiting for him all along. Arthur had spent his whole life under the shadow of the Appalachians, but he didn't buy into the old stories. The townsfolk loved spinning yarns about cursed hollows, haunted farms, flickering lights where no one should be, and noises drifting out of empty cabins. He always nodded, polite, and shrugged it off. Too many folks mixing superstition with cheap whiskey. But when he stumbled across the homestead on Wilder Creek, he started to understand why those stories never died. Why they were whispered with tight jaws and wary eyes. The house had a reputation even among skeptics. Squatting at the end of a twisting dirt road, miles from any neighbor, The trees crowded around it like guardians, closing in more every year. Built in the early 1900s, it was a skinny, sharp-angled structure with narrow windows staring down into a fog-choked valley. Arthur had first heard about it from an old guy at the hardware store. Casual, like it was nothing. The attic light. Always on, even when storms rolled through, long after the power had been cut decades ago and no one had lived there since the 70s. Arthur dismissed it. Headlights in the distance, sheet lightning reflecting off metal. Nothing supernatural. But curiosity gnawed. The only way to know was to go see. That gray Saturday, storm promised for the evening, he loaded his pack, flashlight, camera, thermos of black coffee, and drove out. The road was worse than he'd imagined. Ruts, overgrowth, forcing him to park a quarter-mile out and hike in. Trees pressed overhead, branches forming a tight, leafy tunnel. Air smelled like wet leaves and rain waiting to fall. By the time he reached the clearing, the wind had picked up, spitting cold drops against his jacket. The house sat there, abandoned in that way only truly forgotten places can be. The porch sagged, paint peeled down to bare wood. Ivy crept halfway up the east wall. Windows were intact but filthy, grime clouding the glass. Arthur circled the house first, checking for footprints, tire tracks, any signs of recent visitors. Nothing. Just the house, the woods, and the storm tightening its grip. The front door yielded to his push, hinges groaning. Inside, the air was thick and stale, like it hadn't moved in decades. Layout was simple. Front room with fireplace, narrow kitchen, hallway to 2 tiny bedrooms. Dust coated everything. Furniture frozen where it had been left. Plates still sat on the table. A rocking chair paused mid-sway by the window. Arthur moved slowly, snapping photos, documenting the decay. Floorboards creaked beneath him. Somewhere inside the walls, he heard faint rustling. Animals. Wind. Maybe both. Nothing else. He was about to leave when he spotted it. The ladder. Almost missed it, tucked into the corner of the hallway. A pull-down leading to the attic. Old but solid, rungs worn smooth. He hesitated, then tugged the cord. Ladder fell with a screech, sending up a cloud of dust that made him cough. Up he climbed. Attic low, cramped, ceiling sloping sharply. Had to duck to avoid hitting exposed beams. Flashlight cut a narrow swath of light through the darkness, revealing piles of old boxes, a broken chair, yellowed newspapers tied with string. Cobwebs thick in corners. Mildew hung heavy in the air. Then he saw it. At the far end, atop a small crate, a lantern burned. Not gas, not electric, just flame, steady and small. Soft yellow light pushing back the shadows. Arthur froze. No smell of kerosene, no heat, no smoke. Impossible. He crept closer, ducking under beams, boots stirring dust. Lantern didn't flicker, didn't move. He crouched a few feet away, hand hovering above it, still cold. Nothing. No warmth. No logic. Just light, clean, relentless. He stepped back. It seemed farther. Blinked. Stepped forward. It drew back. Step after step, the space refused to behave. Small attic, maybe 20 feet end to end, but distance bent, stretched, tethered to some point he couldn't reach. His pulse thumped in his ears. Thunder rolled distant, low. First flashes of lightning lit the trees outside the tiny attic window. Storm coming. And in the lantern's glow, he thought he glimpsed something else. Shadow? Figure? Hard to tell. But it moved against the flame in ways that didn't match him. Arthur didn't wait. He retreated to the ladder, never turning his back fully on the impossible light. Dust clouds and creaking wood met him as he descended. Back in the hallway, hands on knees, gasping. Rational explanations scrambled in his mind. Optical illusions, reflections, swamp gas. But none fit. He had seen it, felt the warp, and he knew, stomach twisting, that lantern had been waiting. He left without looking back. Rain hit as he reached the truck, hammering the roof, streaking the windshield. Hands tight on the wheel, he stared at the house. Lightning lit the sky, and in that brief flash, the attic window glowed. Lantern still burning. Arthur drove away, silent, the rain hammering down like fists on the roof of his truck. He didn't speak of what he'd seen, not to anyone, not even to himself. He told himself he needed time to sort through the photos, time to find a thread of reason he could pull. But later that night, when he checked the camera, the attic shots were all black. Not blurry, not underexposed, solid black. Every single one. Only the yard shot, taken as he left, showed the house against the stormy sky. And in the attic window, unmistakable even in digital grain, the lantern's soft glow burned. Weeks passed. Arthur told himself to move on. But something gnawed. 3 weeks later, broad daylight, clear sky, he went back. Needed to see. Needed to confirm the lantern wasn't a trick of storm and shadow. The house looked smaller now, like some sad relic abandoned and forgotten. He climbed the ladder with grim resolve. Attic just as before. Cramped, low ceiling, piles of old boxes, broken chair, stacks of yellowed newspapers. The crate was there, but the lantern was gone. Arthur moved methodically, lifting boxes, probing every corner, lifting floorboards. Nothing. No lantern. No trace it had been there at all. Dust, cobwebs, faint smell of old wood. The attic had swallowed it. He sat on the floor long minutes, staring at the empty crate, trying to reconcile what he'd seen with what was in front of him. And then, behind a warped trunk, he found a stack of journals. Pages brittle, water-damaged, but readable enough to piece together a story. The house had belonged to a man named Samuel. He lived alone after his wife passed. His entries described brutal winters, the isolation, storms pounding the valley, and the attic. One February 1971, Samuel wrote about being trapped during a blizzard when the ladder collapsed. He wrote of the cold, the dark, the fear pressing down like the trees outside, and how he had lit a lantern, the only company in that vast, empty silence, waiting for help that never came. The final entry was barely legible, shaky, fading. The light is all I have left. Arthur closed the journal, replaced it carefully, and climbed down. He left the house, heart still racing, mind reeling. He never returned. Back at home, he followed local news obsessively, scanning for mentions of Wilder Creek, the homestead, anyone else going out there. Every few months, a distant shot surfaced online. House at night, attic window glowing faint yellow, storm always raging. Comments mixed skepticism and unease. Arthur never added his own voice. Years passed. The house on Wilder Creek sank further into decay, collapsing slowly under rain, rot, and forest. The road deteriorated. Fewer people made the trek. Yet the light, according to those who watched, never stopped. Storm after storm, year after year, the same soft yellow flame flickered in the attic window. Arthur moved away, took a job in another state, built a life far from the mountains, far from the weight of that homestead. But on stormy nights, when thunder shook the windows and rain hammered hard, he couldn't sleep. He thought of the lantern, of Samuel alone in the dark, clinging to that single point of light, and he wondered, with a shiver that never left, if the light had ever been meant for the living at all, or if it was simply a signal, burning endlessly in the dark, waiting for someone to understand what it meant to be trapped in a place where time had stopped, and the only thing left was the flame. Harper had a habit of logging every hike she did. Photos, notes, GPS points. She kept proof. Proof she'd been somewhere real, not just staring at a squiggly line on a map. Most of her routes were mainstream. State parks, trails everyone knew, paths posted online by other hikers. But every so often, she'd stumble onto a ghost trail. No signs, no footprints, no hint anyone had passed through in years. Those were the trips she lived for. She discovered the Ridge Trail one early spring, tucked behind a crumbling stone wall along a back road. No marker, just a narrow gap between two weathered oaks where the brush had been flattened ages ago. Harper parked her car at the turnout and followed the gap. The trail climbed, tight and twisting through dense hardwoods and over jagged outcrops of moss-stained stone. About a mile in, it leveled on a high ridge. The view opened for a second, then closed again under a canopy of trees. That's when she spotted it. A shack, maybe 50 yards off the trail, half swallowed by laurel and skinny pines. Small, like a garden shed. Rough planks made up the walls, the rusted tin roof sagging dead center. No door, just a black rectangle facing away from the trail. No windows, no chimney. Someone had thrown it together and walked off. Harper froze, pulled out her phone, snapped a shot. The shack felt wrong out here, miles from the nearest house, the trail barely visible. She logged the spot in her GPS app and scribbled a note in her journal. Old shack, no access road, around 1.2 miles from trailhead. She didn't approach. The day was fading, and she still had the hike back. But the image lodged in her mind like a tick. 2 weeks later, she returned. Light was better, and she had more time. The path felt familiar now, easier to follow. When she reached the ridge, Harper had to scan for a moment to find the shack. Laurel had thickened, or maybe she had misjudged the distance last time. Either way, it was still there. Rough boards, sagging tin, dark opening. She left the trail and pushed through the brush. Up close, it was worse than she expected. Boards nailed haphazardly, gaps where wood had warped. Stones and rusty nails pinned the roof down. The dirt floor sagged slightly, like it had settled over decades. Nothing inside. No tools, no trash, no sign anyone had used it. Just 4 walls, a roof, and a darkness that smelled old and empty. Harper took photos, backed out, and hiked down. It was ordinary. The kind of minor find she usually forgot by the next week. But this shack stuck. Odd moments she'd think of it. Washing dishes, waiting for the bus, lying awake at night. What was it for? Too small for a cabin, too far from water to be useful. It wasn't on any map she could find, not even the old survey plat she dug up at the county records office. A month later, she returned a third time. The trail had started to fade, brush closing in, but she still knew it. Reaching the usual turnoff, she paused. Something was off. Scanning the ridge, she caught the roof in a slightly different place. Closer. Not by much, maybe 10 or 15 yards, but enough to make her stomach knot. Her mind raced. Misremembered? Maybe. GPS didn't lie. She checked her phone. Coordinates matched. She was standing exactly where she had before. Harper approached cautiously. Rough planks, sagging roof, black doorway. Walked around it, checked the ground. No drag marks, no shifted foundation. The shack still sat directly on the earth. The trees, though, the laurel that had partially hid it was farther back. The pines framing it had moved. Or maybe they had always been there and she just hadn't noticed. She photographed every angle, landmarks, distances, then left. A strange chill crawled over her skin she couldn't shake. Months passed. Harper returned 5 more times. Each visit, the shack edged closer to the trail. Small moves, imperceptible in a day-to-day sense, but clear to her measurements. Less than 20 feet from the path now, impossible to ignore. Harper began bringing a tape measure, recording exact distances. Each time confirmed her eyes, it was moving. She tried rational explanations. A prank? Someone dismantling it, rebuilding it closer? Didn't hold. Nails rusted in place, boards untouched. No one on that trail had passed her. On her 7th visit, the shack changed in another way. Inside, something appeared. A chipped ceramic mug, white with a thin blue stripe. Harper froze. She had owned that exact mug, snapped the handle a week ago. This one had no handle. She didn't touch it, heart hammering. Then she saw a scrap of paper nailed to the wall. Pulled it down. A grainy, faded screenshot. Her social media page. A photo she had posted 2 months prior, right here on this trail. Harper bolted, not stopping until she reached her car. Locked doors, shaking hands. She realized someone had been tracking her. The shack hadn't moved. It had been bait. And she had walked right into it every time, marking herself. That night, she deleted all her hiking posts. No tags, no locations, no photos. She swore off that ridge. And for a while, it seemed enough. For a while, it seemed like it had worked. Harper sold the hiking posts, erased her tracks online, and avoided the ridge. She stopped sharing her routes, stopped tagging trails. For months, the shack didn't appear. Strange objects ceased showing up. She convinced herself it was over, tied to that ridge, and she had finally outrun it. Then it started again. Small glimpses at first. Driving home, a flicker of rough planks and a sagging tin roof among the trees along the highway. She blinked, and it vanished. Just a trick of the light. Another time, hiking a trail on the opposite side of the county, she saw it, half hidden behind birches. She spun around and didn't go back. The worst was one evening in her own backyard. Harper's house sat on the edge of town, a narrow strip of trees separating her property from a field. Just as the sun sank, she glanced out her bedroom window. There it was, at the far edge of the tree line, unmistakable. Rough boards, sagging roof, dark doorway. Harper froze, breath fogging the glass. She slammed the blinds shut and didn't open them for days. She told herself she was losing it, that fear and stress were conjuring illusions. But the evidence stacked up. Boot prints in soft dirt near her fence, hers. Broken ceramic in the driveway, the same blue stripe. And the nights, the slow, deliberate scraping of wood across brick. She stopped hiking entirely, sold her car, moved into a small apartment closer to town, surrounded by neighbors, no trees in sight. For months, it worked. No sightings, no objects. Harper convinced herself it was over.
Then, one morning, she opened her front door to leave for work and froze. On the welcome mat was a single photograph, cheap paper curling at the edges from damp. The image showed the shack, but from inside this time, looking out through the dark doorway. In the distance, just barely visible, was her apartment building. Harper's hands shook as she picked it up. On the back, cramped, uneven handwriting. Closer every time. She moved and moved. Each time she thought she had created enough distance, miles, state lines, to break whatever tie had formed. But it didn't matter. The shack always found her. Not physically all the time, not always in full form, but in shadows, glimpses, hints. Shapes that weren't right. The smell of old wood and rusted tin where there should be none. Every month the feeling strengthened. Something was closing in. A patient, relentless stalking, step by step. She stopped looking. No more checking behind her. No more scanning the tree line. No more opening blinds at night. Harper understood, her chest tight, mind spinning, that the shack had never been a place. It was a sign, a marker, something watching, deciding she was worth following. No matter the distance, no matter the locked doors, the new names, the fresh addresses, it kept moving. And one day she knew she would open a door, turn a corner, wake in the dark, and find herself staring into that doorway, the threshold of empty shadow. And whatever had been waiting, patient and quiet all this time, would finally reach out and pull her in. Henry always said the mountains never scared him. Storms, yes. Copperheads, absolutely. But the old houses scattered along the back roads? He called them deadwood. Empty shells eaten through by time. Nothing more than landmarks for locals and warnings for tourists. Lucas didn't argue, but he never quite believed him. Not after the stories his uncle used to tell. Not after the things he'd seen as a kid. Strange shapes moving inside broken windows. Whispers sliding across porches thick with rot. But Henry was his closest friend. And when Henry wanted to explore an abandoned homestead at the far end of Carver Ridge, Lucas went. The house didn't show up on most maps. For years, people said it collapsed in on itself, or burned down, or was bulldozed by a logging crew. Nobody could seem to agree. Maybe that's why the idea hooked Henry so hard. By late afternoon, they were hiking up a narrow game trail, the kind that looked like it belonged more to deer than to people. Cold wind scraped through the branches. The sky pressed down low and heavy, the color of old pewter. Lucas adjusted his pack. "You sure this is the right way?" Henry held up a folded county survey map like it was a treasure map. He grinned. "Positive. House should be right at the top of that rise." Lucas didn't know how he could sound so relaxed. The woods felt wrong. Too still. No insects buzzing. No birds calling from the canopy. Even their footsteps sounded muffled on the leaf-littered ground, swallowed before they could echo. They reached the ridge and stopped. The house crouched at the far edge of a clearing, a long, sagging shape with walls the color of old bone. The porch leaned like it was exhaling. Windows sat dark and hollow. Half the roof was collapsed inward, the shingles torn off like something had clawed through them. Henry whistled. "She's bigger than I thought." Lucas wrapped his arms around himself. "You ever seen a place rot that fast? Something about it looks wrong." Henry chuckled. "Man, everything out here looks wrong." But as they walked across the clearing, even Henry slowed. The grass around the house looked brittle and gray. No tracks, no animals, no life. It was as if the earth had given up trying to grow anything near the structure. The boards of the porch groaned when he stepped onto them. Lucas stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Henry, do you feel that?" Henry turned.
Feel what? Lucas swallowed. Like the air's thicker. Henry shrugged. Probably just colder in the shade. But Lucas knew cold, and this wasn't cold. It felt like pressure, like pushing through deep water. He followed Henry anyway. Inside, the smell hit them first. Not rot, not mildew. Something flatter, sterile, like old dust sealed away for too long. The living room opened into a wide space of collapsed beams, broken glass, and peeling wallpaper curling like dead skin. Lucas kicked aside a fallen picture frame. The photo inside had long since faded to a smear of gray. Henry stepped ahead of him, scanning with his flashlight. Look at this place. No graffiti, no beer cans, no footprints. You'd think nobody's been here in 50 years. Maybe longer. Henry turned back and grinned. Even better, right? Lucas didn't answer. His eyes kept drifting to the walls. They looked too smooth in certain places, like someone had scrubbed them clean. A perfect, unnatural clean that didn't make sense in a house abandoned for decades. They moved deeper. The kitchen was a skeleton. Ribs of cabinetry leaned sideways, the fridge door hanging open like a jaw. But beyond the kitchen was a narrow hallway, untouched by collapse, untouched by anything, perfectly preserved. Something about that bothered Lucas more than the damage. Henry swept his light down the hall. 3 doors, bedrooms or storage probably. Lucas grabbed his arm. Let's check the upstairs first. No stairs, Henry said, pointing with the light to where the staircase had rotted into splinters. We're exploring the back rooms. Lucas hesitated. His breath felt heavy, slow, like the house was breathing for him. Henry opened the first door. Nothing inside except a busted dresser and a thin film of dust on the floor. An oddly uniform layer, like powdered ash. Lucas's skin crawled. The second room was the same. Then they reached the third door. Henry pushed it open. Lucas blinked. The room was empty. Completely empty. No furniture, no debris, no dirt, no dust. The floorboards looked pale and polished, as if they'd been wiped down recently. The walls were smooth and unblemished, not a single crack or stain. It didn't match the rest of the house, didn't belong to it. Henry stepped inside first. "Hold up," Lucas whispered. Henry turned. "What now?" Lucas stared at the doorway, at the frame, at the way the shadows curved into the room even with Henry's flashlight blazing. "You don't feel that?" Lucas murmured. Henry let out a breath. "Lucas, it's just a room." But Lucas wasn't convinced. He tightened his grip on his flashlight and stepped across the threshold. It was colder inside, too cold, but not like winter, like a place that had never known warmth. And the air, it moved. Barely. A slow pulse that brushed his face like breath. Lucas's throat tightened. "Henry." Henry raised a hand. "Yeah, I feel it now." A long moment stretched between them. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Then something, very softly, shifted under their feet, like the faintest rise and fall of a sleeping creature. Henry swallowed hard. "Let's not be in here long." They didn't speak as they backed slowly out of the room, each step measured, careful, as though any sudden movement might wake whatever lay beneath the floorboards. The closer they came to the doorway, the heavier the pressure grew, like the room didn't want them to leave. Lucas felt it first, a tug in his chest, a slow tightening behind his ribs. Henry froze at the threshold, his breath hitching. "You feel that?" he whispered. Lucas nodded. "Yeah, don't stop. Go." Henry forced himself through the doorway. The moment his second foot crossed the frame, the pressure snapped off like a breaker switch. Lucas stumbled out behind him, gasping as air rushed back into his lungs. The hallway, dim and dusty and crooked, felt like freedom. The door behind them creaked shut, even though neither of them had touched it. Henry jerked around. Nope, absolutely not. He backed away, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. Lucas stared at the door. There was no draft, no open window, nothing that could have made it move. But it had closed, deliberately, quietly, like a set of lips pressed together to hold something in. He swallowed. We're leaving. Henry nodded. Good plan. They turned down the hallway toward the living room, but the air felt different now. Thicker, heavier, as if the entire house knew they were trying to leave. Their footsteps didn't echo, not even a little. The silence clung to them like wet fabric. At the front doorway, Henry reached the porch first and stepped out. Lucas was one step behind him when the house exhaled. Not a breeze, not settling wood. A breath, slow, deep, drawn from somewhere inside the walls. The porch boards vibrated under Henry's boots. Dust rained from the rafters. Lucas froze with one foot still inside, one foot on the threshold, his hand gripping the molding as the air pulled inward, cold and deliberate, like the house was inhaling through a long, invisible mouth. Lucas! Henry's voice cracked. Move! Lucas lurched forward, stumbled onto the porch, and the moment he crossed the threshold, the pressure vanished. The air released. The house went still again, sagging into its old, silent shape as though nothing had happened. The two of them didn't breathe for several long seconds. When Lucas finally looked up, the sky over the clearing seemed lighter, brighter, as if stepping out of the house had returned sound and color to the world. The wind stirred the grass. A crow cawed somewhere on the ridge. Henry wiped sweat from his forehead. We were in there maybe 20 minutes. Lucas shook his head slowly. Felt longer. They didn't talk on the walk back. The forest felt different now. Not peaceful, but watchful. Like the trees knew what had happened. The silence in the woods felt thinner, easier to breathe in. But neither of them dared mention the faint sense that something unseen followed them until the trail twisted downhill. Halfway to the truck, Henry finally spoke. You ever feel like a place didn't just scare you, like it noticed you? Lucas exhaled. Yeah, that room. Henry swallowed hard. Not the room, Lucas. The house. Lucas didn't answer, because he knew Henry was right. Back home, the night pressed itself against Lucas's windows like a damp cloth. He kept the lights on, tried to watch TV, tried to ignore the rhythmic heaviness in his chest, the way his breathing sometimes dragged too slow, as though something inside him remembered that strange, steady pulse in the floorboards. It was almost midnight when his phone buzzed. A text from Henry. My walls are creaking. Not like the usual. It sounds like breathing. Lucas stared at the message until his vision blurred. Another text arrived. You think it followed us? Lucas didn't sleep that night. He kept imagining that perfect, empty room, its smooth walls, its cold air, the way it had felt patient, hungry, listening. And he wondered, if they'd stayed even a few seconds longer, what the house would have done once its breath finally ran out.